Easter Monday, 1282. Outside the Church of the Holy Spirit in Palermo, a French soldier named Drouet drags a young married woman from a crowd gathered for evening prayers. Her husband kills him on the spot. When other French soldiers try to avenge their comrade, the crowd falls on them. Within hours, the chant "Mort à nous les Francesi," death to the French, is ringing through the streets of Palermo. Armed Sicilians pour into every inn and house and convent where French soldiers or officials are billeted. They need a way to identify French soldiers who have shed their uniforms and hidden among civilians. They devise a test. Pronounce the Sicilian word "siciri," chickpeas. Native French speakers cannot produce the sound with a convincingly Sicilian accent. Those who fail the test are killed immediately. Even monks who cannot say the word correctly die. 2,000 French are dead by morning. Within 6 weeks, across the whole island, the total is 13,000. The French have lost Sicily. The massacre has a name: the Sicilian Vespers. And it starts one of the strangest chains of events in medieval history, ending 2 years later with a crusade launched by the Pope of the Catholic Church against a Catholic king on behalf of a French boy who had never been to Spain to give him a kingdom he would never actually rule. This is the story of the most absurd crusade ever called. And the reason it matters is not the crusade itself. It is what the boy who watched it fail grew up to do. The island of Sicily sits at the center of the Mediterranean. Whoever holds it controls the sea lanes between east and west, the trade routes between North Africa and Europe, the approach to every major Italian port. Popes, emperors, and kings had been fighting over it for centuries. In 1266, the Pope handed Sicily to a French prince named Charles of Anjou. Charles was capable, ambitious, and deeply unpopular with the Sicilians almost immediately. He taxed them heavily, he excluded native Sicilians from positions of power, he used the island as a base for his own imperial ambitions across the Mediterranean, ambitions the Sicilians were paying for and dying for and had absolutely no interest in. He did not visit the island after 1271, he governed through intermediaries. Sicilians who had traditionally been able to petition their king in person were now expected to accept decisions made in Naples by men who had never seen their farms or their cities or their faces. The old Sicilian tax system, built across centuries of Islamic, Byzantine, and Norman rule, full of exemptions and local accommodations, was replaced with a stricter system that offered relief only to those of French origin or those Sicilians who had made themselves useful to the Angevins. Everyone else paid more for less. For 16 years, the Sicilians endured it. Then on Easter Monday, 1282, they stopped enduring. The rebels needed a king. They invited Peter III of Aragon, who held a legitimate dynastic claim through his wife Constance, granddaughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, the last ruler Sicily had actually respected. Peter accepted. He had been conveniently positioned off the North African coast with his fleet, officially on campaign against Saracens. When the Sicilian delegation arrived, he feigned indifference for several days, a performance for the Pope's benefit, and then sailed for the island. Charles of Anjou had lost everything. But Charles had powerful allies. The Pope, who had given him Sicily in the first place, and the King of France, Philip III, whose uncle Charles was. The Pope at this moment was Martin IV, French by birth, effectively a tool of French and Angevin interests. In November 1282, Martin excommunicated Peter of Aragon. Then he declared Peter formally deposed as king, on the grounds that Aragon was technically a papal fief, a status inherited from a decision Peter's grandfather had made decades earlier, surrendering the kingdom to the Holy See in exchange for political support. What the papacy had accepted as a fief, Martin argued, the papacy could now take back. Then in 1284 he went further. He called a crusade, not against Muslims, not against pagans in the Baltic forests, against Peter of Aragon, a Catholic king ruling a Catholic country, excommunicated for the political sin of taking a throne the papacy had already assigned to someone else. And he bestowed the crown of Aragon on Charles of Valois, son of the French king Philip III, 15 years old, who had never been to Aragon and spoke neither Aragonese nor Catalan. His connection to the kingdom was exactly and entirely the Pope having decided he should rule it. The crusade was nakedly political, dressed in the language of faith, but everyone involved understood what it actually was. France trying to reclaim strategic control of Sicily using papal sanction as legal cover. The French nobility showed considerable reluctance to participate. Philip III spent 2 years building enough political support to actually launch the invasion. The most unjust, unnecessary, and calamitous enterprise the Capetian monarchy ever undertook. That is a competitive category. The Capetian monarchy undertook quite a lot of calamitous enterprises, but this one earned the distinction. It launched anyway. In 1285, Philip crossed the Pyrenees. Every road south from France was blocked with men and animals and supply carts stretching back beyond the horizon. Cavalry, crossbowmen, infantry, the full machinery of a royal army on crusade, moving at the pace of its slowest ox. 100 ships waited in southern French ports to keep them fed. The army advanced into Roussillon, burned the city of Elne, massacred its population, despite the presence of papal legates who were theoretically there to ensure the crusade behaved with the spiritual gravity the Pope's blessing implied. The cathedral was burned. The sole survivor of the city's defense was an illegitimate nobleman the chronicles record only as the bastard of Roussillon. He had negotiated his own surrender. Everyone else died. Gijona fell after a siege. The French army was winning on land. Charles of Valois needed to be crowned. There was a ceremony. There was a cathedral. There was a throne. There was the full weight of a crusading army standing behind the boy. There was not, however, an actual crown. No one had thought to bring one. Cardinal Jean Chollet, attending the ceremony, solved the problem by removing his own hat and placing it on the boy's head. Charles of Valois became known as the Roi du Chapeau, the King of the Hat. Crowned with a cardinal's headwear, in a city his army had just besieged, over a kingdom that had absolutely no intention of accepting him. While this ceremony was taking place, the Aragonese navy arrived. Roger de Loria was the admiral of the Aragonese fleet. Historians have described him as probably the finest naval commander of the 13th century. He had already destroyed the Angevin navy off Naples. He had captured the son of Charles of Anjou at sea and brought him to Messina in chains. He fought in the darkness when other admirals would not. His tactics were precise. He lured enemy fleets out of defended harbors by feigning retreat, drawing them into open water until their formation dissolved, then turning to attack into the confusion. He drilled his crews, crossbowmen, Almagarva light infantry, Catalan oarsmen, to a standard his opponents rarely matched. On the 4th of September 1285, he met the French and Genoese fleet off the Catalan coast near the Formigues Islands. He had placed 2 lanterns on each galley to inflate his apparent numbers in the dark. The French and Genoese commanders could not accurately count his ships. They were still trying to read the lights when Lauria's oarsmen were already pulling hard into the attack. The Genoese galleys fled without engaging. The French ships that remained were captured or sunk. The French admiral was taken prisoner. The entire French ability to resupply their army by sea was gone in a single night. The land army began to die. Dysentery swept through the camp. Philip III contracted it himself. The army that had marched into Catalonia with crusading indulgences and 100,000 men was now a sick, depleted force hundreds of miles from home with no naval lifeline and winter coming. Philip opened negotiations with Peter for safe passage for the royal family through the Pyrenees. Peter agreed. He had no interest in capturing the French king. The royal family was permitted through. The army was not covered by this arrangement. At the Col de Panissar's Pass, the old Roman road through the mountains, the main route since antiquity, the Almogavars were waiting above the tree line. The French rearguard came through in column, half dead from weeks of dysentery and retreat, unable to form a line on the steep ground. The javelins came from above before anyone saw where they were thrown from. Men who had marched south as crusaders died in a mountain defile with no enemy in front of them and no way to turn around. Roger de Loria, fresh from destroying the French fleet, had put his sailors ashore and joined the fight on land. According to the Chronicle of Ramon Montana, the celebrations in Barcelona lasted 8 days. Philip III of France died of dysentery at Perpignan in October 1285. Pope Martin IV had already died the previous March, forced out of Rome by a civil uprising, taken ill, gone. Peter III of Aragon died of fever in November. By the end of 1285, every major figure who had started the crusade was dead. Charles of Valois, King of the Hat, never received his kingdom. He spent the rest of his life collecting titles to places he never actually ruled. Claimant to the Latin Empire of Constantinople, candidate for the German throne, nominal king of more territories than almost any man in Europe. He died in 1325, hold titles and nothing else. The financial cost to France was catastrophic. Loans from the Aragonese War were still being repaid in 1306. 20 years later, the campaign had emptied the treasury and achieved nothing. But the deeper consequence was not financial, it was personal. Philip III's heir had accompanied the army. He was 17 years old when the Crusade launched. He watched it collapse into disease and military disaster in the Pyrenean passes. He watched his father die of dysentery contracted on a war the Pope had told everyone was holy. He watched God, apparently, decline to deliver the outcome the papacy had guaranteed. When Philip III died at Perpignan, his son became Philip IV of France. Philip the Fair. He had no sympathy whatsoever for papal authority over French affairs. Not then, not ever. 22 years later, Philip ordered the arrest of every Knight Templar in France in a single, coordinated dawn raid. Tortured confessions out of them, forced the Pope, by that point his political captive, to dissolve the order entirely, and relocated the papacy to Avignon in southern France, where it would remain for nearly 70 years under French pressure. The medieval papacy's independence, its ability to call crusades against kings and expect kings to obey, its claim to stand above secular politics, all of it broken by a man who had watched, as a teenager, what happened when it tried. The Pope had launched a crusade to make a king. He had made something far more dangerous instead. He had given a 17-year-old prince a lesson he never forgot.